This is traditionally the time when we talk each week to Craig Stobo, as we know, one of New Zealand's leading economic, political and commentators, and obviously with an unrivalled ability and experience in the commercial sector as well. And he joins us now on the day in which the government the Department of Statistics has just released its GDP quarter, and we are officially out of recession. According to Grant Robertson, the Labour government's managed the economy well. We've turned a corner. Craig, Hosanna! It's all looking bright and roses, is it not?
Good morning. Well, it's sunny in Auckland, so that's another bonus.
Before you came on, mate, I was just looking at the breakdown from the Department of Stats on this, that shows that the reason we've had a growth quarter is nothing to do with agriculture or manufacturing. In fact, over the last 12 months, they've both declined quite significantly. But the real growth has been internal, the New Zealand's internal economy. And I speculated, you'll know much more than I, that was possibly as a result of as much money being pumped into the economy and going around the roundabout. Have I got that right or wrong?
Yeah, so the two highest positive categories were electricity and gas, kind of utility sector, going at more than 3%. And the second highest was government services, administration, call it, which was 2.8%. So they're two very strong drivers compared to what I call, the standard living, the export-orientated part of our sector. Part of our economy, which is primary industries, etc. So, yeah, they're obviously struggling. And the GDP's been supported by, to a large extent, by public administration, which has to be financed by taxation or by debt, which is part of our problem. I think if you have to sort of reflect onto the consequences of this, and we've spoken about this before, but my view has been for some time, and the IMF affirmed that in their visit, that the government is a large contributor to GDP. The fiscal impact that they identified was just under 2%. The IMF identified just under 2%. And that's obviously unsustainable because we have to borrow, unless we put taxes up, we have to borrow to be able to do that. So that's unsustainable. My concern is when the RBNZ looks at this and says, well, these numbers are too strong and the government hasn't pulled its jets, we're going to have pressure on interest rates.
Yeah.
So the next OCR review is the 4th of October. We're currently sitting at 5.5%. So my pick is the Reserve Bank will have to move, if not in word, but in deed. And when I alerted your audience to the benefit of just cross-checking your thinking with gdplive.net, they've been pretty accurate in saying that GDP would be stronger than the market forecasts and that the pressure on the OCR remains. In addition, overnight, the Fed Reserve, although they kept US interest rates the same at 5.5, they have clearly signalled one more hike in their interest rates, and that pushed 2-year benchmarks interest rates in the US to their highest point since 2008. So the productive sector, the sectors in our economy that are focused on the cost of debt are going to face more pressure. And I would urge your listeners to look at election policies from the parties that are stimulatory, that will add fuel to the fire and mean that we will have interest rates higher for longer, which just means more pain. So I thought we'd just sort of try and wrap that up in terms of consequences. Yeah, okay, the economy's growing stronger, but why? Well, we've probably got an indication of why. And what are the consequences? It just means more pressure on interest rates, which makes it harder for the rest of the productive economy to do what they do well.
Craig, you would have looked at the policies of all of the major political parties. I know you've been critical, you were last week, for example, of the National Party's policy for being stimulatory. Can I ask you, from a dispassionate point of view, and obviously there are more ways than one to skin a cat, but just from a stimulatory point of view, and I mean a non-productive stimulatory point of view, which parties have the best policy from your viewpoint and which the least?
Well, I think the basic premise here is that using the current account deficit that is what we earn from overseas exports and what we pay for importing goods and services. We're living beyond our means. So which party is thinking medium term about redressing that imbalance? Borrow and spend is increasingly unsustainable when you've got a forecast track now of gross GDP going to over $200 billion in 2026-28, which is just less than 50% of gross GDP and leaves no buffer for the emergencies and the disasters and Wuhan 2 that I mentioned last week. So you have to think about packages that reduce spending and not put more pressure on taxation or borrowing. The National Party's policies, that self-contained, self-funding package was okay in its own right, but it's like an island off the coast. It doesn't address the underlying issues, and I'm looking forward to more announcements from them around how they're going to address the structural spending issues that we have, which goes to the delivery of goods and services to Kiwis. ACT is more structurally focused and is looking to address unproductive activity and to cut government spending to right size. So they are on the right track structurally. All the parties struggle to communicate that to the electorate because that means pain, and who bears the pain? But you can't have it both ways. Ultimately, if we keep going on the current track, we will just have a higher cost of debt, higher interest costs and debt repayment schedules for the productive sector of the economy, which is what we need to grow to get out of this issue. So that's my view, Mike.
Okay, so you didn't answer the question though, which is, unlike you, Craig, I'm assuming...
Well, I think there's lots of detail, right? And it's more around the big picture, focusing on actually our debt issue, our quality of spending issues, and to try and do that without pushing taxation up any further. Which parties are advocating for that? And people can make their own minds up.
This listen, I have an 18-year-old and a 16-year-old daughter, and my 18-year-old's making her first vote, Craig, at this election. And she says to me, Dad, are they all like this? As in, she's been bribed from so many quarters, from so many parties, that if she votes for them, they'll give her stuff. And I said, no, I actually think this is the biggest bribe election I've actually lived through in my entire life. What's your impression?
Yeah, I agree. The number of boondoggles coming out from the current government almost on a weekly basis without thinking about how that adds to the debt or taxation profile is unconvincing in terms of being upfront with the electorate around how you're going to fund this. And I think that's inappropriate. So, yes, you can vote for baubles, you can vote for boondoggles, if you think that's going to advance your own individual position, but ultimately it means a more difficult place for people to live and work, and will mean relatively a lower standard of living than what we all want, and we will lose some of our people offshore, which may well happen to your daughter, Michael.
Yeah, well, no, listen, I have very little doubt both of them will find their lives offshore, unfortunately.
There's one other thing I'd like to tangentially talk about, if it's okay, around...
Yeah, go for your life.
So I don't know if people heard overnight, but Rishi Sunak, the UK Prime Minister, has made an important speech around deferring the conversion of petrol diesel cars to electric cars from 2030 to 2035, and taking away any penalties for flying, which was mooted as a way of trying to restrict, greenhouse gas emissions. You and I have talked before about the politics of 2030 and trying to get to gross emissions reduction of 30% by 2030. The National Party is already deferring on methane from our farmers. It looks like there are Northern Hemisphere politicians who are finally figuring out that the cost of transition is becoming a really important political issue, and we need to have that debate in New Zealand. So I just want to contrast some issues that I read the last few days from the Manhattan Institute and the International Energy Agency around implications of transition economics And your listeners might be interested to know that globally, only 3% of total world energy, primary energy sources, is from wind and solar. Only 3%. 10% is still from wood, which is enormous. In addition, the way our politicians focus on CO2 is to focus on domestic production of CO2 or GHG. But of course, that just goes into the atmosphere and moves around the world. You can't sort of contain CO2 just to a New Zealand component of global CO2. And when you look at the clean car discount that's still in effect, the wording in the policy is if you choose a zero or low emission vehicle, you're helping to reduce New Zealand's CO2 levels. But of course, they go around globally, don't they? They don't just stay in New Zealand. And only focuses on the consumption part of the life of that vehicle. It doesn't look at the costs of producing that vehicle.